Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jason. Delighted to welcome you here this afternoon to join with Senators Manchin, Perdue, Warner, and Tillis to discuss the initial findings of what we call our Appalachia initiative. We all came to this project recognizing that the economic challenges facing the Appalachian region are complex. They are in many ways pernicious, but we do not believe that they're insurmountable. With the support and leadership of these four senators and their offices, we convened a series of workshops throughout the spring where we brought together a number of regional and national experts and stakeholders. We focused our inquiries on four different areas: on job training, economic development, healthcare challenges, and infrastructure, all in the Appalachia region. Consistent with the work that we do at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we took a rather deliberate and hopefully obvious approach. We first sought to try to accurately define the problems. We then tried to create a balanced and quaintly evidence-based assessment of the different issues, and then really tried to dig in with a lot of creative thinkers to develop solutions that we believe could appeal both pragmatically and philosophically across political divides. We are encouraged that there are a number of ideas that we will discuss today that have enjoyed the support of all four members sitting with me today. But even more encouraged that the senators have committed to engage their differences in the service of creating a truly bipartisan plan for the region they represent. I think we believe that the story of this country is not a passive kumbaya agreement, but it is the constructive collision of ideas when you have proud and principled partisans who are willing to sit across the table from one another and effectively, meaningfully disagree in ways that advance the discussion. And that's been the spirit of this conversation thus far, and it's why we really are so delighted to be able to be supportive of it. So we now have a little while. I'm going to be able to ask some questions, explore some of the ideas here, and then obviously hopefully we'll talk a little bit about where the issue goes, and then turn it over to a second panel to dive in a little deeper. So just to get it started, I think, as mentioned, each of the senators led a specific area. Senator Warner led the discussion around education and workforce, Senator Perdue on job creation and entrepreneurism, Senator Manchin on energy infrastructure, and Senator Tillis on rural health. And maybe if we could just start with you, Senator Manchin, and go down the line, just some reflections on that experience, what you took away that you found the most compelling, in some ways where you think there are opportunities.
Well, rural America, and those of us who represent rural America, and West Virginia is probably the ruralmost state in the country because we have not one city larger than 50,000, so we're a state of towns, to be quite honest. So in the challenging areas, we have the terrain. We know we have challenges there, and Thom will be talking later, our transportation secretary, and what we're doing to overcome that, but also connectivity. I've often said that if you think about in the 30s, if you lived in a metropolitan area, you probably had electricity. If you lived in rural parts of Georgia, Tennessee, West Virginia, you probably didn't. And FDR thought it was to move our country forward in the 20th century, we had to be electrified. So we had rural electrification. We need rural broadband. We need to have connectivity. We can't make it without it. And we will have abject poverty if we don't, if we can't communicate. And you have pockets of these poverty where people, and you can just look at transportation and everything that goes with it. For us to revitalize our economy, and that's what we were all here about, how can we jumpstart the economies of each one of our states, but collectively as Appalachia? West Virginia has an opportunity right now. We've always been a large fossil state of coal, as you know. And there's going to be a certain amount of coal needed for the next 20 years or more, even by the EIA's estimate, because it's a baseload fuel. And we can do it cleaner and better, and the technology we develop can be shipped around the world. But most importantly, we have found a newfound treasure in all the natural gas that's been in the fracking, as far as in the rock formations. That's been unleashed right now. And with that, in West Virginia, in certain parts of our state, we have the butanes and the propanes that come with it, the wetness that's used as a stock feed for all some chemicals and manufacturing and things of this sort. So now with the, if you look at what happened with the natural disasters we've been having with Houston, the Southwest continues to get battered. We've got all our eggs in one basket from an energy country down in that Southwest that really is vulnerable. we could have what we call a Mid-Atlantic storage hub and a Mid-Atlantic storage revitalization of the chemical industries, if you will. And we can do everything in a smaller scale than what they're doing Southwest because we don't have the ports. But we have the protection of being in the middle of the country that is not subjected to all this horrific, violent weather changes. The storage hub that we're working on right now is a collaboration of West Virginia, Maryland, Ohio, not Maryland, West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky's coming because that's where this newfound gas shelf has been located. If we can keep that wetness and store that, then we're going to be able to build off of that and attract the crackers and the manufacturers that will follow. That's going to be a tremendous revitalization for the area. The biggest problem that we've had over the years, we've looked at our borders as being obstacles. So the border of West Virginia versus Virginia, there shouldn't be a border when it comes to economic. When Mark and I were both governors, we have one town in southern West Virginia and southwest Virginia, Bluefield. It's Bluefield, Virginia, and Bluefield, West Virginia. Down the middle of the road, depending on what side of the road you're on one side of the town or you're on the other side of the town. Well, guess what? After all these years, and he and I preached this, they have finally started working collaboratively. Chambers of Commerce, sharing revenues coming back from different types of things that they're doing, and it's just prospering. It'll do well. So I'm excited about this, but also I want to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center, Jason, you and what you have done, and your entire team, giving us the opportunity to look in depth at what we can and the challenges we have, but also the opportunities. And with every challenge comes a tremendous opportunity. So I think we have that right now.
We're going to come back on that energy question because I agree with you. There's incredible possibility there. Senator Perdue, you've talked about basically the question of innovation and capital formation. I think if we listen to you lead those discussions, where do you see the opportunities to bring that kind of entrepreneurship and innovation more into this region?
Well, let me echo what Joe started with, and thank you guys at the Bipartisan Policy Center. I think this is a tremendously encouraging effort that you've undertaken here, among others. But I'd like to remind everybody that's listening and is in attendance that it's not lost on me that we're sitting here with four business guys, from four states that all, touch on each other and business backgrounds talking about economic development. You mentioned innovation and capital formation. I mean, if you look at the economic miracle that we've enjoyed here in the United States since 1946, it's the greatest economic period in the history of mankind in terms of growth. And I personally believe, having lived through much of that it was based on innovation, capital formation, and the rule of law. Now, there are other countries that are developing around the world today that have one or more of those, but very few have all three at the level that we do. Combine that with the best workforce in the history of the world. I mean, we still are the 800-pound gorilla in terms of economic potential. Now, I want to go back to that economic miracle of the last 7 years has not been enjoyed by everyone in the United States equally, and very few societies are able to accomplish that. But in Appalachia, we've had decades of challenges there based on location, geography, transportation issues, and so forth, that we have an opportunity now to specifically focus on that, and that's why I was so happy to join these guys and looking at this. But let's look at other parts of the world that had equal challenges just in my lifetime. I lived in Singapore for a while, and I was there during that economic, it wasn't a renaissance, it was an explosion. 3 million people, they created a top 10 economy on the back of really 4 things. And that's within a government that was growth-oriented, all right, that wanted to help encourage growth. They worked on 4 basic things. Water, they had to have clean, potable water, which Singapore had none, by the way. Cheap, dependable electricity, which you mentioned electricity. In my lifetime, in my childhood, there were parts of Georgia that we were not electrified. And I remember the rural electric co-ops that came and electrified. And I couldn't agree more. We've got to have connectivity in these communities. But cheap power, clean, potable water, a world-class workforce, and the best infrastructure in the world. Now, what Singapore didn't just work in Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew, who was a premier at that time, and he's not a model for political, he's not a great political model for us, but from an economic point of view, he is the quiet architect of the miracle economically in China as well. And if you look at those 4 things, we've taken many of those 4 things for granted over the last couple of decades under leadership of both parties in this town. What I think the opportunity now here is to focus on what's keeping us from going to Appalachia. And I really believe there are a couple of key things within those precepts of what we just talked about. One, I couldn't agree more. We've got to be connected. But two, I think we've got to attract capital. Innovation is not worth anything if we can't attract capital. Well, to attract capital, you have to have a return on investment. And I think right now we have some situations where in the world we live in, over 80% of the workers in the United States work for companies that employ fewer than 200 people. Small companies are the employment engine of our great America. That's true in Appalachia too. So the question is, how do we get these small businesses capitalized and moving? Well, the first thing is I think we have to look at some of the capital requirements of small and regional banks today. I think that's precluding some really reasonable investments with some of these small companies. The second thing is I think some of the regulations that might be inhibiting small companies from a standpoint of cost of compliance and adhering to the rules that we put on some of these small businesses. Workforce development I could not highlight any more strongly. One of my first jobs was in a Head Start program teaching kids to read, and later in life I was the chairman of the National Commission on Adult Literacy. So I've seen this from two different perspectives. And right now in Appalachia we have a tremendous opportunity. It's not just a challenge, it's an opportunity. You've got a great workforce. They need to be educated to the job demands that are currently available in the workforce today. That means these technical colleges, which are greatly underutilized today, need to be promoted. In my lifetime, when I was growing up, going to a vocational school or a technical school, I just gave you a word from 30 years ago, 50 years ago, but a technical school was held in just as high esteem as going to college. And that's not the case today, and we've got to change that. There are kids that run my hometown today that I graduated high school, and they went to these technical schools and started their own businesses, started banks. They're the economic engine of that part of our state. We need to do that in Appalachia, and I think the opportunity is there to do that. And lastly, I think when you talk about entrepreneurism, that is exploding around us. These kids that are coming out of high school and college today have all these ideas. They want to start these businesses. You have people in mid-career starting businesses. We've got to help them facilitate their access to capital, to employment, and there are federal programs and state programs that can help them do that. And I think there's an opportunity for us to streamline how we make that available to them. So when I look at this opportunity, I compare it to other opportunities in the world that had greater challenges than we had fewer resources. So when I look at the opportunity here, I'm very optimistic that with some focus, I agree with Joe, the potential here is really unlimited.
Senator Warner, you've thought a little bit about these workforce issues of late. I've heard you talk about them once or twice. What appealed to you in this conversation?
Well, let me also start the same way David, Joe did, and I'm sure Thom will as well. In fact, BPC, this is not the first time I've partnered with BPC. I think it's one of the best organizations in town. I also echo a little bit what David said. The fact that all four of us can read a balance sheet is slightly different than many of the colleagues on both sides of the aisle that we work with here. I want to also give a compliment to the working group that spent a lot of time on the product here. And there's folks from all over. I want to recognize, as a former governor, you always recognize state legislators. You recognize Israel Quinn from Abingdon, who's going to speak on the next panel. And I want to make two quick comments on what both Joe and David said. I don't think we can underestimate the need for broadband. It is remarkable how often I hear, not just in Southwest Virginia or Appalachia, but all over the state, broadband's not going to guarantee your success, but if you don't have it, you're not even in the game. And we're going to need somebody who eked out a living in the cell phones. We're going to need a more forward-leaning policy, because we're not going to be able to wire down to every house and every holler across Appalachia. So that last mile on wireless, I think we need a much more proactive policy from the FCC in terms of, in effect, trading more readily available spectrum for those enterprises that will guarantee full build-out of broadband. And I think there may even be some areas around one of the issues that we've kicked around for a long time up here, and depending on who's in charge, it flips back and forth, but we're going to need some level of finality around net neutrality at some point. And the notion that a part of that deal in terms of the providers would be making the same kind of coverage guarantees that frankly the government mandated back with original telephony and then rural electrification. We're going to need to think through that in a way because broadband is absolutely essential. I'd also echo what David said in terms of access to capital. We do need community bank, regional bank, reg reform, so that we have seen a lot of the business lending shift from the major enterprise money center banks. It's all, they don't do small business lending anymore. It really is the community-based banks, and there are areas where, frankly, there's broad bipartisan agreement. But we also need some early stage capital. I would commend all of you the very good work that Steve Case has done with this effort around Rise of the Rest. We're not going to have a fully flourishing Appalachia, or for that matter, rural America writ large, and I say this respectfully to my friends in California, New York, and Massachusetts, but when 78% of all the venture capital just goes to those 3 states. I've tried some of this before. It's hard. I started a venture capital fund in Southwest Virginia at absolutely the worst time. There's been subsequent efforts to try to do that, but that early stage capital is really important. Workforce, a couple of quick comments. One, some of the work that the panel did was really good. I think the notion of regional collaboration teams that emphasized in the report, really good idea. Too often, I'll speak more from Southwest Virginia standpoint, you had enormous regional rivalries. I think about where Joe mentioned Bluefield, Virginia. Bluefield, Virginia's in Tazewell County, and for a while Tazewell County, relatively small little county, had 4 separate high schools. You couldn't get regional cooperation inside one rural county, let alone the idea of regional cooperation between counties and towns. But those days got to be in the rearview mirror, and I think the report puts out some really good ideas around that regional collaboration teams. I think the idea of a more expanded and more flexible Pell Grants. A lot of the kids in our communities aren't going to have all the economic resources, so Pell Grants that might go towards part-time work, Pell Grants will be available in high school for those credits that are college eligible, earn them in high school, knock off that first semester or first year. It really makes a lot of sense. Shorter term Pell Grants in terms of, as again David mentioned, around vocational and technical training. We can do some of that reform at the federal level, and we want to do it. Another initiative that came out of the report that I think is a great idea, and that is a domestic study abroad program. Think about kids in major metropolitan areas who all want to go study in Paris or Barcelona or China or France, wherever. I think at a high school level, the idea of communities partnering with each other, and even in high school, getting kids exposed from Appalachia into metropolitan communities, but particularly vice versa. I think, as I think we've all grown to know, Joe's grown up with us our whole life, but there is no better quality workforce, there's no prouder people, there's no better quality of life in many ways than is offered in Appalachia. And too many Americans, particularly if they live on either coast, or they come away, frankly, ignorant of a lot that goes on in rural America. And this domestic study abroad program is an interesting idea. Final comment, I don't want to go on too long. I was back in coal country in Southwest Virginia in August, and I come to this really with a sense of a lot more renewal and hope. I think as both Joe and David mentioned, a lot of these communities have been struggling with the changing economic landscape, the notion you mentioned on small business, that's going to be the future. It's not going to be a single large employer the way a mine used to be, or a textile mill in many of the communities as well in parts of my state. But I saw in that little county in Tazewell, in the town of Tazewell, a main street that 10 years ago when I was governor had one store on it and everything else was empty. Today in Tazewell, little town of Tazewell, every shop is occupied. They're open 160-person restaurant in another 10 days, and there is a vitality in this small town that didn't exist a decade ago. I went a little further south, in far southwest in Wise County, and they were talking there. We were doing with the community college and University of Virginia Wise. They want to be on the cutting edge of drone deployment and drone training. At that community college, they had drone training courses, and they were lined up with folks ready to study, also lined up with folks ready to get jobs. as with Israel later that same day. This may not be quite as it's entrepreneurial, at least, where we kicked off the Southwest Virginia craft brew beer trail. 16 craft breweries around Southwest Virginia. Those jobs aren't going to export. We got great natural beauty, but it's a kind of a next, that notion of where the entrepreneurial activities. And then finally, in a community a little bit further east, where community in concert with Microsoft was actually trying to train every one of their teachers in computer coding. I would quickly add to my friends from Georgia and West Virginia, and even my friends from North Carolina who are pretty good on some of the education stuff. Virginia's going to be the first state in the country to require at a K-12 graduation that computer coding and computer science be taught, in elementary school, middle school, and high school. And that's a great notion, but you got to have the teachers to be able to train, and that was happening. So I think there was a great sense of renewal. We from Washington sometimes need to get out of the way, and in areas where we've got some common agreement, actually push the ball down the field, because if we do that, folks in the community will take it and run.
So if the press says, Warner says, solution to Appalachia is moonshining, you have only yourself to blame. Senator Tillis, you led a really rich discussion on the issues around healthcare, and there's a variety of challenges there, but where would you like to focus your first thoughts?
First off, I want to thank first BPC, Jason, and everybody in the staff who have worked on this. I particularly want to thank my staff and the staff of all the offices who have worked together to collaborate. And I want to welcome a friend and colleague, Dan Gerlach, who I believe is on the next panel from the Golden Leaf. I had the pleasure of working with Dan on a number of opportunities that were really state-centric. I mean, we could be having this discussion in the context of things that we were trying to tackle when I was Speaker of the House, and Dan was working in an area that had to do with economic development, but also helping some of our more challenged rural counties, not only in the mountain region, but out in the east and parts in between. I feel like one of the things, in reading the recommendations, we can get to specific questions, that as a management consultant, these are the business guys who ran businesses, and then when all of a sudden they weren't getting quite what they wanted to get, they'd hire consultants to come in. No, seriously, to say, okay, this is what's working, this is where the white space is, and this is how we get to a conclusion, then they kick us out and have problems paying their bills. But but the point that I'm making, it's about mobilization. If you look at, for example, let's take the recommendation around opioids. That's a classic example of, I think there's some great suggestions in here about regional cooperation, about education, about healthcare professionals and people coming together to attack this challenge. I immediately think about what's the inventory of things that are working, maybe in isolation, or best practices that we should leverage. To what extent could we use the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act to go back at it, because that was more or less a model of federal policy engaging state and local entities within the boundaries of the state. But how do we look at the unique characteristics of the opioid epidemic in Appalachia and say there's something different there? So maybe there needs to be a way to flow resources and programs that cross states and counties and look at it from a regional perspective. I think when you're talking about education opportunities, the same thing. One of the challenges that I had as speaker is, everybody has this tiering system for the most prosperous to the most challenged counties, but you kind of draw the boundary around county lines. But that can run into all kinds of problems, because you can have a rich side of a county. I mean, everybody thinks that Brunswick County is a rich county, but that's down on the coast. But there are parts of Brunswick County that are very poor and have more in common with a border county. So how do we start looking at ways to regionalize things that, traditionally have been drawn more along state lines? So when you talk about telemedicine and you think about the policy changes that would need to be made at the state level to really affect cross-state collaboration in areas where it makes more sense. I'm looking forward to taking these recommendations and doing an inventory of things that we can leverage, and then figuring out how this initiative can fill out the white space. And I do like the recommendation about business collaboration, for example. I think that there are, the mountain regions, probably all of them, I can speak for North Carolina, have a disproportionately high amount of unemployment. They also have significant health problems. One of the ways that you make addressing the health problem for the unemployed population is figure out how you produce better health outcomes and better cultural understanding of the need for good health and hygiene among the employee base. So what sorts of programs can we work with at the state and federal level to make sure that employers are doing their part with the part of the population out in the mountains that they already connect with every day or every week in the course of their employment. So to me, it's the strategy document. We've got a great strategy document. We more or less define the problem set. Now it's a matter of figuring out how we mobilize an inventory of things that are working in isolation, identify the white space, and then start clicking off what are going to be problems that some of our successors will ultimately be working on. We're just laying the groundwork or pouring the foundation. But again, I want to thank everybody for being here, and I want to thank the staff and the participants on this panel and the next panel. I will say, Jason, in your opening, we were talking about our partisan differences. You probably need to pick other panel members if you want us to have a lot of partisan differences. Because I think we tackle most of these sorts of situations from a business perspective first. And there may be a few cows, but I think for the most part, we're generally in consensus on how we get there as well.
We're delighted to work with you. Just want to give you a little room because you all have constituencies. I think, and this, actually, that's where I'd like to kind of take the conversation a little bit now to the what next. So there are a lot of agreements around this table around these issues, but each of these issues touches a bigger issue. I think we have a lot of agreement on the table on what to do about opioids, but that touches the health care debate. I think there's a lot of shared sense on some of the regulatory